Migrating to AWS is a 2-day course which discusses how you can plan and migrate workloads to the cloud. It's very much focusing on the strategy and the approach that you're using. So things like portfolio discovery, the actual migration planning, the actual migration design, as well as the execution and the validation and integration of your migrated applications with your other AWS services and other on-premise environments. It contains hands-on labs. It's focused also on group activity, and as well as that also includes case studies that have been developed over many years to help you understand the migration process. So it's looking to achieve the explanation of the migration strategies, to understand things like cloud migration readiness. Is your organization ready to migrate? Look at the whole challenge of discovering, portfolio discovery and planning, and then how to put together the planning of your actual migration strategy, and finally to actually do the performance of the migration and validate it once you've moved your workloads into the cloud. Also on this course, we do touch upon the importance of optimizing your applications after you migrate to cloud so you can benefit from the cloud aspects, things like paying as you go, things like the ability to use infrastructure as code, and so on and so forth. It's intended for IT professionals who are involved at the project level. So either as project managers or as architects involved in the whole migration project. Also people who are part of a cloud center of excellence, so that key part of the organization that is going to spearhead the migration process. Before doing this course, it's recommended that everybody who takes part has understood the concepts covered in AWS Business Essentials. They understand the business benefits of moving to the cloud. In AWS Technical Essentials, we talk about some of the basic AWS services, things like EC2, S3, RDS, and networking using VPC. So it's important to understand those concepts because they will impinge upon the design of what you're going to migrate. It's also recommended that they either have experience of architecting on AWS or they've attended the Architecting on AWS 3-day course, which will give them a basic for making the key decisions in designing applications that will go in the cloud. And here we touch upon things like the well-architected framework. And it obviously goes without saying that they need to be familiar with mid-range IT infrastructure, hardware and software concepts to a reasonable extent, because that's what their workload will consist of when they migrate it. The course is very much an instructor-led discussion. It's not just presentational material, it's also trying to draw from people specific real-world challenges they're facing, using example case studies as a way of drawing out some of the main concepts that occur during the course. And also there's a few hands-on labs. There's the opportunity to play on the AWS console itself, and also some exercises in planning and organizing and structuring how you would put together a portfolio of deployment and migration into AWS. So let me just cover some of the key concepts that are covered in this course, one of which is a mental model of how migration looks. Initially, you're looking to evaluate your opportunity, what are the benefits I'm going to get, and assess that in relation to your existing IT estate. Subsequently, you're then looking to scope that migration once you've analyzed and discovered more detailed information about your existing IT infrastructure landscape. That then leads to a planning and designing process, which is very often multiple threaded. So what you will no doubt see is multiple applications will be running through and being deployed maybe in parallel, but certainly according to application type, for example. Then there's the actual migration process, which is not only involving migration itself, but also integrating those applications and workloads into either the existing on-premise or to their new AWS counterparts, and validating before we would hand over applications into the new operating model. And that's important to emphasize, that when you move from on-premise environment into AWS, do expect that you will have a new way of operating. There will be different techniques used for managing, monitoring, capacity planning, and so on and so forth. It's very important that we emphasize that there needs to be a very clear business driver for cloud migration. And typically there are a number of different drivers that might happen. It might be simply a cost driver. What you're wanting to do is take advantage of the fact that you're paying as you go rather than having to purchase capital investment in order to provision a new service. The ability to experiment, the capability of being agile is often the main reason why organizations move to the cloud. It gives them the ability to provision infrastructure, to experiment with new products, to deliver new services and experiences to their customers much quicker. If those experiences work, then they can double down and go into production. If it turns out that they're not going to work, they can withdraw those services, and they've got very little cost involved. It's been operational cost rather than capital cost involved. And sometimes there's a significant business impacting event, the introduction of a new CTO or CIO, or new management or board level decision making, the requirement to exit a data center, for example. These are all drivers which can result in migration to the cloud. So it's very important that we, from the very beginning, understand what our business drivers are. That not only helps us plan our cloud migration, but also helps us understanding what the key success factors will be when we actually do the migration. So there are a number of different strategies that you can use to migrate to the cloud for each workload, dependent upon the conditions of that workload, dependent upon the features of that workload. You've got this migration path. One of the options is to actually retain something for the time being. Very complicated workloads that have got a lot of dependencies, those which require very low latency, for example. It may well be appropriate at this stage, at least, to retain them there, to retain them on premises at this stage. There are other workloads where the solution to migrating to the cloud is simply to retire or decommission those applications as no longer providing the level of business value that they previously provided. So those are two options that do come up when you're looking to move a workload away from your on-premise solution. Another approach you can use is what is known as rehosting, sometimes called lift and shift. This simply involves taking the application infrastructure you've currently got, say you've got a number of Red Hat Linux machines, for example, and lifting them up from your on-premise location and rebuilding those same machines exactly as they were in the cloud. And that can be done. There's automation and migration tools that are available to help customers do that. Another approach that some customers use is a little bit more involved. It's called replatforming. What this involves is not just taking the infrastructure and moving it, but actually looking to platform it onto a new environment. Examples of this is you might move from one version of Windows Server you're currently using on premise today to a later version of Windows Server. You might want to move from a proprietary Unix environment running perhaps proprietary Java runtime environments and maybe move it into an open source Java runtime environment running on Amazon Linux too. So you need to understand what your new platform will be. You need to obviously do a certain amount of application refactoring at times to modify your infrastructure. Make sure you make use of migration tools and obviously test that. Another approach actually involves replacing the existing workload with something that is a bit more cloud native. So a repurchasing exercise. So commercial online software, for example, commercial off-the-shelf software might be an example of where you would simply go back to the vendor and say we'd like a later version of the software that's more cloud native, or alternatively you might have to go through an RFP process to identify alternative suppliers that produce something that is more cloud native for you. And another approach that you can use, a much more radical approach, is called refactoring. What this involves is taking the application that you currently have and refactoring that application and building it in a cloud native way. For example, you might currently have a website which has got, I know, a dozen separate methods associated with it, each of which are associated with individual modules within a Java application, and perhaps running on some sort of Linux stack. You might refactor that by writing it as a number of individual functions in Lambda, front-end it using API Gateway, and build it as an entirely cloud-native application. So that's a complete refactoring. Obviously requires more time, but there are significant benefits in refactoring your application to make it a purely cloud-native, to take advantage of some of the features that AWS give you. And of course, as part of this, having done this integration, we have to emphasize the importance of validation, of building a proper cutover strategy, and building your new operating model. If you compare those strategies then, those 6 R's, there are certain benefits in terms of time, there are certain benefits in terms of cost, certain benefits in terms of quality. For example, there's often a trade-off. If you're going to refactor your application, that may well require a certain amount of time, and that could well be take longer than the other approaches. It's certainly in terms of cost and actually getting your teams working on refactoring your application, that will be a cost. On the other hand, in terms of the quality and the ability to be more agile in the cloud going forward, that's going to give you a huge benefit. If you compare that, for example, with a simple lift and shift approach, such as a rehosting there, it will be faster to achieve. It will cost less for the actual migration. However, you're not going to get all of the benefits that you would do from a complete refactoring exercise. So for each individual workload that we're dealing with, we need to understand what is the most appropriate pattern to use. Another concept that we introduce in this course is what's called the Cloud Center of Excellence. The idea that what you build together is a team which is going to specialize on managing the migration to AWS. It will need to be properly staffed with perhaps assistance from AWS professional services or AWS partners, plus your own native on-premise teams. So you're going to need to make sure you've got your migration team, have your business teams on board, the application owners themselves, the operations team leads who will be taking on the applications once they go live. And from that, you would build a RACI chart and determine what the roles and responsibilities will be for each one of those members of that Center of Excellence. Another concept we talk about is what is known as the migration factory. Migration factory is that whole process that we use for going through the discovery, analysis, planning, designing, the actual migration, the integration, validation and operation of each individual application. So typically what customers have is a prioritized backlog, and that prioritized backlog is then fed into the migration factory in a structured way, using maybe some sort of sprint approach, and the migration factory then churns around and is responsible for the migration of each of the individual groups of workloads or applications, as we might call them. Also key to this is what's called portfolio discovery. In order to know what you can migrate, you need to find out what you've got. So you need to understand two things from each of your applications. You need to understand the business details of your application. You know, what's its refresh cycle? Is it end of life? What's its business commitment to it? Effectively, what is the value to the business of each individual application or workload? And then obviously you pair that with the technical details of the individual applications. You know, what servers have you got, what operating system you've got, how is it connected, and what is the current utilization of it. Because there's no point migrating a 24-way machine to another 24-way machine in the cloud if it turns out it's only being 5% used. So you need to understand its current capacity utilization as well. So very much part of this course is the whole concept of putting together appropriate planning. So get the technical details, get the business details of your application from the business owners, determine which of those migration strategies is going to be appropriate on a workload by workload basis, prioritize that, and then work on tools for the actual migration. So it's very much the center of this, the success factor for migration, is appropriate planning and organizing. The actual migration itself is an iterative process. You do the migration, you then validate that the workload works in situ. You then need to ensure that you can integrate that with not only the old applications that are still remaining on premises, but also integrated with the applications that have already been migrated to AWS. And then you need to do a cutover process. That will often mean removing things like replication mechanisms and so on, decommissioning of old infrastructure that is in your on-premise environment, doing a full cutover and handover to operational support inside your AWS environment. Cutover strategies can often involve things like making use of Route 53. So you could put live traffic to your old on-premises environment. You can replicate data across. Are we good to go? We've done our migration, and at that point we can then move our live traffic across, take some downtime, a final synchronization, and a live traffic switch over. You can then do the having done the integration and validation, do your smoke test, and then you're in live running. During the course, we have a number of work groups. We break people up into small groups and ask them to do some planning work as well as doing things like labs. This is an example of the sort of output that came from a recent delivery of this course. One of the small teams got together, came back with this workload sprint plan for our famous Go Green enterprise. We determined which particular applications were going to be migrated in which particular order, what were the priorities, and so on and so forth. So this is the sort of delivery that we would be expecting from the small breakout groups. AWS has got a number of services that can help you in migrating to the cloud, and many of these are discussed during this two-day course. For example, one of these is the Application Discovery Service, and the purpose of that is to help you identify what your infrastructure looks like in order to help you make the right decision making to migrate to the cloud. It's actually using two different approaches. You can use an agentless approach, and there's also an agent-based discovery, and it stores that data in a managed database that AWS provides for you. Also available to you as a tool to help you with migration is what's called AWS Migration Hub. Migration Hub is a central portal that holds together both the discovery information, the ability to analyze and process the discovered data, to group servers together and associate them with a single application, which is a entity for the purpose of migration. Might not be the same as your application, but for the purpose of migration, we're going to call this an application. It can oversee the actual migration, which might be being done outside Migration Hub by something like Cloud Endure, for example, or could be done inside by other services like data migration services or server management services. And so it acts as a portal to track the status of your individual migration processes. So server migration service, database migration service, Cloud Endure, other third-party products such as Atadata and River Meadow and so on, all of these can feed into Migration Hub so that you've got a perspective on your entire migration status of your program. If we actually have a quick look at that, there is this is an example from the AWS console of Migration Hub. This is what it looks like. I've got a number of applications that have recently been updated, small numbers of servers. I've got some migration status information. If I look at the discovery side, I've got a number of servers that I've actually discovered. I've actually got a number of agents that are running right now. What I can do is I can actually start some data collection and retrieve some data on those agents, some historical information. That then ties in to the Discovery connector and the Discovery agent. I can also, if I choose to, import my own discovery information if I want to use third-party tools. The data that I've actually got on the specific servers, let's have a look at that, tells me about its MAC address, host name. It's not, that one's not actually got much information on. Let's have a look at this one here. There we go, there's a bit more information here. So the CPU type. These are actually AWS servers that I'm just using for demo purposes. What operating system am I using? What's my RAM, CPU utilization, and so on. And I can export that data as I want to, for example, S3. Here's an example of an S3 bucket where I can have that information available for me. In order to analyze that data, I can either go into Migration Hub itself. Alternatively, I can make use of Amazon Athena. Amazon Athena enables me to run queries directly on the S3 bucket. Here I've got a query that's just identifying the number of agents, or the name of the agents that are running on machines where there is an Nginx server running. So I've got a process running the Nginx server, and it looks like I've got about 6 machines that are running that particular server, and that will help me in my migration planning. So that's Migration Hub, which is one of the labs that we cover during the course. What we also cover during the course is the server migration service itself, which is capable of taking a source environment, such as a VMware environment, put a connector on that, and the connector is able to communicate with the SMS service over the internet and to build Amazon machine images, which can then be used to launch the actual target servers in AWS. And this will run on VMware, but also on Hyper-V. We also need to talk about the data migration itself. So there are a number of different patterns that we can use for actually migrating data. In a physical way, we might make use of VPN, we might make use of Direct Connect. And then on top of those type of circuits, we might make use of storage gateway, we might make use of parallel transfer to S3, And there may be occasions where the volume of data is so high that we need to make use of the AWS Snow services. So things like Snowball, which is a ruggedized container of disks, which is provisioned for you, sent to you. You hook it into your own data center, and then you can transfer 50 terabytes of data onto it. It can then be couriered back to AWS and can be put onto S3. If we've got large amounts of data, or we need to do some processing of that data as part of the transfer, we can make use of Snowball Edge, which is also available in a rack-mounted form, so we can transfer quite a large number of terabytes that way. Or indeed, if we're dealing with petabytes of data, it's even possible to make use of the Snowmobile truck, which is a ruggedized container of disk drives, enabling us to transfer literally petabytes of data from on-premise to AWS. Of course, it's all very well moving the data. We need to understand how to move the database itself, which that data represents. So we have a requirement to do things like schema migration. There's a requirement to be able to migrate stored procedures, other database objects like views, triggers, and so on and so forth, as well as the data migration. And of course, what's very important as part of this whole process is that we have got a mechanism to verify that the source data and the target data are identical, that the schema has been migrated correctly, and the data contents have been validated. One of the tools AWS have got that we discussed during this course is what's called the schema conversion tool. And the purpose of this tool is to convert database schema from one database engine type to another. For example, if I were migrating from on-premise Oracle and I wanted to move across to, for example, Amazon Aurora running Postgres, the schema conversion tool would migrate the schema definitions for me, converting the various object types, integer types would move across to the corresponding Postgres type. It could also pick up the fact that in Oracle perhaps all of the tables are in uppercase, whereas in Postgres they'll be moved across to become lowercase. Things like PL SQL stored procedures, for example, those can be identified and migrated across, and any anomalies highlighted so that you could manually fix those as well. So schema conversion tool can help us actually move data structures from one source engine to a target engine. And that might be for online transaction processing databases or indeed for data warehouses. Having done that, the database migration service can then be used to read data from your on-premise database via what is known as a replication instance and move that data onto a target database. And that could be a target database such as the Amazon RDS suite of databases or DynamoDB or indeed some other target. There's a number of different database types that can be used as a source and a number of different target databases which the DMS service can manage. So for example, I might have a Microsoft SQL server on premises, and I might decide to move that to Amazon Aurora running MySQL. And that can be done by DMS once the schema conversion has been done by SCT. The actual process of DMS is relatively straightforward. Your application owners are currently working on-premise, connecting through to your on-premise database. You start what's called a replication instance. You connect that replication instance to the source, which is on-premise, as well as to the target, which is in AWS. You define which tables or schemas or databases you want to migrate. And the DMS service will actually migrate that for you, create the target databases and load them, and can keep them in sync for a period of time until the final migration happens. And then things like stored procedures and indexes can also be created at the same time. And finally, you can switch your application over to your target, for example, an Aurora database on AWS. So that can all be managed through DMS. One of the labs that we do as part of this course is an example of migrating a database to Amazon Aurora. If you have a look here, I've got a couple of EC2 instances, one of which is called a command host, and this one here has actually got a MySQL database on it. And so this is representing my on-premise instance. So my on-premise database is that one here. I've also created, under RDS, I've also created an Aurora MySQL database here. And that Aurora MySQL database is going to become my target, which I will use to migrate. So I'm going to be using the Database Migration Service. I have here a replication instance, so I'm ready to go. But before I actually do that, let me just connect through. So here I'm going to create a SSH session. And I'm going to connect through, first of all, to my source database and just see what I've actually got on my source database. So I'm going to use the MySQL client, connect through to the source database, show databases, and you'll notice that there's a database called country. So this is the one that we are wanting to migrate. If I have a look at the tables that we have there, I've got 6 tables available there. I'm going to run an SQL query which is going to retrieve for me the sum total of the number of rows in that table, in those tables. And you can see from here that I've got something like about 1.6 million rows of 1.7 million rows of data available in those tables, which is what I'm going to actually migrate. I'll just leave that now. What I will now do is I'm going to connect to my Aurora database and just have a look at that. So first things first, I'm going to quickly have a look at the Aurora database, which is here. And this is the endpoint which I need to connect to. In fact, I probably will connect to the writer endpoint in this particular cluster. So having captured that endpoint name, I can now just quickly write an SQL connection to connect to this database. So this is now connected to Aurora. If I do show databases, there is no country database. So compare that with what I had previously. Those were the databases I had in my source, and there's just those 3 there. So let's leave Aurora for a minute. What we are now going to do is we're going to migrate something over 1 million rows across from the source to the target. So let's just go to DMS. This is the Database Migration Service, and what I'm going to do is first of all go to Data Migration Tasks. I am going to create a brand new task. The task identifier, let's call it this, shall we say. Okay, and I'm going to use as my source the replication instance. That's the instance that's going to do the hard work. I'm going to read from my on-premise database, and I am going to write to my Aurora database, and I'm going to migrate existing data. A few other things that I need to do is have a look at which table mappings I need. This particular case, I want to choose a schema, and the schema is country. And I'd like to have all tables migrated. I'm going to include all the data. I don't have any transformation rules to add. Okay, and I'm just going to create that task. So what that is now going to do is, just if we move back to the previous slide. Okay, so what that will be doing is moving the data from my on-premise environment. It will be migrated across by DMS using this replication instance, put into my target Aurora database. What I will then be able to do is switch over and connect to that target database, and I will be able to actually see all the data and move my application across. Let's see how we go. Create is successful. The task is actually starting. What you can do is, of course, monitor the target as it runs through. You can have CloudWatch metrics can run, show you what the bandwidth is, show you how much throughput there is. Individual table statistics are available to me. How many rows have I got? How many have I moved through? How many have I implemented? The task is still starting right now, and that will take another minute or so. It's running through right now. Let's have a look at the table statistics. If I quickly refresh that, it will show me which tables have been migrated. A couple of them have been migrated already. Still running right now. Looks like it's pretty much finished. Still running at the moment. 99% finished. So we'll just give it one more second, and we have got all the data. Which tables are we missing? Yeah, I think let's run them all now. Quickly have a look at any no assessment results found right now. There we go, and load is complete. We have migrated all of our data. Let's verify that. So what we'll do is we will reconnect to our Aurora database, show databases, and country is there. So let's use that, and I will just pick up that same SQL that I ran before. You may recall the numbers that we had. Let's just quickly run through those again. Okay, and those numbers look at a quick glance. These look as if they're pretty much the same as we had previously in our original source database. So we've done the actual migrating of the source to target. In this case, the source was a MySQL database, and the target was an Amazon Aurora RDS database. So just to summarize about migrating to AWS then, one of the features we share with customers, we share with students, is this migration process mental model, and we go through different phases of this mental model, explain how each of those phases can be implemented, what the success factors are for each of those. We also talk about this cloud migration journey, and particularly the validation, cutover, and operations side of it, so the 6 R's. And we talk about the cloud migration factory, the actual migration process itself, the discovery, analysis, planning, designing, the actual migration and integration, and then validation and handing over to the new operational type. So that's a 2-day course that is available as instructor-led training. If you're interested in signing up for that course, go to www.aws.training, search for Migrating to AWS, find a class and register for it. The class ID is currently 10026. And so hopefully you'll be interested in signing up for that course, in which case myself and my colleagues will be looking forward to meeting you at some times in the near future. Thank you very much for watching.